So welcome back to the Insurgent Mindset. I'm Rondo Moses.
And I'm Matt Tice. And in the Insurgent Mindset, every week we explore new topics related to the challenger mindset. We look through case studies and emerging thinking. And today we have a great guest ahead of us.
Yeah, we're going to explore the strategies and leadership mindsets that help businesses break away from the pack and stay ahead in fast-changing markets.
Well, Rondo, I think we've got a great session ahead of us today. So I think what we're going to do today is really dig into the mind of one of the great strategy and innovation thinkers of our time, Rita McGrath. So I'll let you go ahead and introduce her, and we'll get started.
Yeah, it's an honor to be joined on this episode by one of the foremost thinkers in strategy and innovation, Rita McGrath. Rita is a longtime faculty member at the Columbia Business School. She's a best-selling author and one of the world's most respected voices on how leaders can navigate uncertainty, spot emerging shifts, and build organizations capable of sustained innovation. She's also a prolific speaker and an advisor to Fortune 500 leaders and the author of several landmark books, including The End of Competitive Advantage and Seeing Around Corners. So, with that, Rita, welcome to the show.
Hi there. It's a pleasure to be here.
Hey there, we're thrilled to have you with us. Thank you.
So, Rita, just to get us started, I think it would be great to hear a little bit about your journey. So, take us back through when you started this sort of exploration of these topics. And, you talk a lot about inflection points. I think it'd be interesting to hear about your inflection points, both career-wise and maybe personally, just to give us more of a sense of kind of your context and where you're coming from.
Sure. Goodness, I guess it would start with going to Barnard College in New York City, which I did in the 80s. And it was a very exciting time to be in New York. The sort of corporate raiders were around, restaurants were booming. It was this very kind of a big hair, was the thing. Um, Leaving Rochester behind and moving to the city was something I'd always wanted to do, but it was definitely an inflection point in the opportunities I had and the access to people that I had. And my first job out of my master's degree was actually in the public service. And the fabulous thing about public service is your career in the first few years, if you're any good at all, it goes like this. I mean, it's just a straight ramp up, and then it goes like that for the rest of your life. So at that, I made the decision to go back and get my PhD, and found myself in the entrepreneurship program at Wharton. And my supervisor at the time was a guy named Ian McMillan. And I said, oh, from my experience in the city, what we had been doing was computerizing. That's what we called it back then, computerizing the procurement operations of the city of New York. And I said, I would love to study the science of implementation. And he kind of looked at me and went, I can't think of anything more boring than the science of implementation, which, as it turns out, is actually a really good topic, but we'll leave that to the side for the moment. And then we had an actual agreement that emerged through a stroke of luck, which was Ira Rimmerman, who was a very senior executive at Citibank at the time, was very interested in having some academic research done around cities venturing programs. So this is their program for creating new businesses from within. And he funded a 3-year study of this. And we did a mountain of interviews and lots of document reflections and everything. And we looked at several dozen of their ventures. And what was great about it is he wanted us to look both at the ones that had been successful and at the ones that had not been successful. And you learn a lot through that process. And so that got me onto looking at innovation in large corporations, entrepreneurship more broadly. And that's where our paths sort of aligned around really looking at these topics of how do you venture under conditions of high uncertainty. And I'd say the first important stake in the ground in that whole line of work was the publication of Discovery Driven Planning, which came out in 1995, so 30 years ago now. And that article was one of the very first to make the argument that when you're in a situation of very high uncertainty, you can't operate as though you knew what you were doing. What you have to do instead is plan, but plan to learn. And that lesson got picked up by the lean startup people, and it's now much more of something that people recognize, but it was considered really radical back then.
Yeah.
So
I
Rita,
love,
just
yeah, I love that. I love that.
Rita, I was just going to say, so Rochester, just out of curiosity, so whereabouts in Rochester? So it seems like we have a parallel track a little bit. I also grew up in
Yeah.
Rochester, and
Oh, did you?
also
So we
more or
grew up
less
in
started
Webster.
my career working with at Lucent,
Ah,
their New Ventures portfolio. So it's very interesting. So yeah, Rochester, I wasn't expecting that.
there you go. So we lived in Webster, and my parents were German. And so we had this running joke in our family that the motto for Webster was "Welcome to Webster, where life is worth living," right? A beautiful little subdivision. But we figured out that it contains every single consonant that's nearly impossible to pronounce in German. So you ended up with "Welcome to Webster, where life is worth living."
Very good. Brilliant. So yeah, I think one thing I found really interesting in terms of my own exploration coming from Rochester is reflecting on the experience of Kodak and kind of I'd say it was formative for me just looking at that sort of, incumbent juggernaut that gave away so many advantages to your point. And I think your concept of sort of fleeting advantage, I'm paraphrasing, but I think that really sort of it reminds me of the fixed cost argument. All costs are variable in the long term, right? It's sort of, all advantages are variable in the short term, right? So it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on, maybe pivoting from your formative years into your current role and maybe give us some examples of some of the, kind of the big cases that you mentioned Citibank that have kind of illustrated your kind of way of thinking about the world in this domain.
Well, I was always really interested in the way big organizations operate. And my first career, as I said, was in the public service, and I was very interested in government and public policy and politics, and how do big social decisions get made. And I'm many of the same interests carried forward into the business world. But in terms of case studies, the discovery-driven planning concept actually had its roots in a whole series of case studies that I did of corporate flops. So these were the big ones, right? These are the ones that, you scratch your head and you say, what could they have been thinking? So, Disney's initial foray into Europe, which was nearly took the company down. FedEx's vision of this thing called Zap Mail, which was basically a fax idea, which is you go to a FedEx office and you hand them a document and they would Zap Mail it to this other office. And that got made obsolete by the introduction of fax machines. Bic's effort to introduce perfume, Bic perfume.
Mm.
And I'm not making any of these up; these all existed. And when I studied these cases, what you realized was that there was a mindset around how they were planned and how they were budgeted, and it was very few, lots of assumptions taken as facts, very few opportunities for low cost testing, leaders who are often under incredible time pressure and told, to go with this, get this out into the market, go move fast, and all the money up front, all the people up front. So you had these big budgets, tight deadlines, lots of pressure to show that you knew what you were doing. And yet, the underlying assumptions in many cases didn't bear out,
Mhm. Mhm.
leaving these companies with a big disaster. So I started a file of these. I call it my flops file. And to get into my flops file, you have to lose your company at least $50 million. That's the bar. and, and the interesting thing is, this continues to this day. You had Anheuser-Busch and Keurig had this thing called DrinkWorks, which was an at-home cocktail maker, and they pulled the plug on that very unceremoniously. And at the end of 2021, I believe, you had Quibi. Remember Quibi, the short form
Yeah.
video thing? It was, and these things keep having Zillow's effort to get into house flipping. And so I think the case studies that have really been informative to me have been both the successes, so there have been enormous successes, and also these dramatic failures. But when you compare them, what you realize is the successes were planned with a real, let's learn what we need to learn. Then we'll look at what has changed in our assumptional world. Then we'll go to the next thing and learn what we need to learn there. And so it's been a much more learning oriented
Yeah.
focus rather than proving that we were right.
So, Rita, what I loved when I researched some of your work, is in particular around discovery-driven planning, was this concept of planning to learn as opposed to planning to be right. And to your point, a lot of organizations go with these big bang innovations and ideas because they think they're right. And you also mentioned this concept of high assumptions to knowledge ratio means blink, 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 red light. That's a vulnerability that you should be thinking about planning to learn and not planning to be right, right? Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. So I think the planning to learn rather than to be right is a reminder that when you're in a fundamentally uncertain situation, and if you're trying to do something new, you're going to be in a fundamentally uncertain situation. Otherwise, you'd be repeating what you'd already done before. So we as human beings don't handle assumptions very well. We have, more cognitive biases than I could list. We tend to take in information that coheres with our previous assumptions. We tend to reject information that calls into question what we already believe to be true. We are very excessively influenced by things that should actually have no bearing on our decision. And. So cognitively, we just have a lot of trouble dealing with assumptions. So you need some kind of structure to help you cope with that. And one of the things we do in discovery-driven planning is we say, write them down. What is in your
Mhm.
mind that should be on a piece of paper so that you and your teammates understand what we believe to be true about the state of the world. So, and then reduce that uncertainty through a series of what I call checkpoints, where a checkpoint is a moment when you're going to learn something. And go into a checkpoint with an open mind. You don't necessarily know what the answer is going to be. Now, this gets into the tricky question of how do we define failure? And I think for a lot of organizations, even today, um, things not going as they predicted that they would is considered failure, and that's not correct, right? If you were a scientist running an experiment, your hypothesis is either supported or it's not, and either way you've learned something. And I
Right.
think that's how we want to be looking at it in business. Either way we've learned something. And this idea of having to be right all the time really comes from an environment where it's much more predictable. And any deviation from norm is a consequence of sloppiness or bad practice or whatever. And yes, you want to stamp out those kinds of failures, but if it's genuinely uncertain and I try something and it doesn't go the way I expected, well, let's learn from that and see what that wisdom holds for us for the next phase.
So
Yeah.
much of the challenge that you described often, I think, is that those assumptions are really quite invisible to leadership teams, right? The easy ones are in front of you and they're kind of there. It's the ones that you're unaware of, or that are deeply ingrained or embedded or built into the orthodoxy of 50 years or 100 years of sort of existence. How do
Absolutely.
you, I guess, a compound question here, Rita, when you're working with a leader, fundamentally, this podcast is about mindset. So much of what you just described is wrapped up in the egos of leadership teams, projecting those biases into decision making. How do you unfreeze that, or at least thought, so that there's an openness to have this conversation, explore those deep assumptions, and then have a different conversation in the C-suite about these issues?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of a number of different practices. So the first thing I try to get them to understand is you may be making assumptions, and what I'll often do is play back what they've told me about their project or their company, and I'll say, so here's what I believe what I believe you've told me, right? So I'll give you an example. Am working with a company that does a lot of maintenance work, and the assumption they make about this maintenance work is that what the customer values is really fast throughput. So if my equipment breaks down, what I really value is it getting fixed as quickly as possible and I'm back in business as fast as possible. And I said, well, are you sure? Because that may be the case for some
Mhm.
customers, that may be true. But there are other customers, like if I drop my car off to the dealership and they tell me, hey, it's not going to be ready till Thursday, and I know that, I'm fine. Keep it as long as you need to get it fixed properly. I'll come pick it up. Like I'm not a time sensitive customer for that particular thing. And what the subsequent conversation was just, oh, well, we never thought about that. And what was happening was that they were actually cutting themselves off from a very large part of the market that just wanted the thing done right. Timeliness was not at the top of their list. Quality
Mhm.
was. And
So,
so, what you find often is you make these assumptions that end up cutting off opportunities or leading you to misread opportunities that are there. So one technique that I use is I play back to them, questioning what are the assumptions. Second set of techniques is you ask them, have you had really diverse perspectives on this? So I don't mean diversity in the politically correct sense. What I mean is, have you had people who are younger, people who are on the front lines, people who come from a different culture? Have you had them really think about this set of assumptions that you're making and ask why those would be true? So one of my idols in business is a guy named David Cody. who was for a long, long time the CEO of Honeywell and really very inspiring leader. And he always used to have this phrase. He said, "Look, I don't have to have the right answer at the beginning of the meeting. What I want to have is the right answer when we leave the meeting." And I thought that was such a great
Mm.
mindset thing, right?
Mm.
Yeah.
I like your example about the customer because it almost like um, we think this way, and it's a very powerful way to think about the world. I like that example about the customer, and there's two things that just come to mind from my point of view, and I'll flip it back to you, Rondo. One is almost the assumption in the example that you gave is that all customers are the same, right? That they're homogenous in some way. That's the assumption, right?
Right.
And sort of turning 90 degrees from an assumption about what one segment wants about in one particular part of your offering. That's really missing the point. The bigger assumption is, hey, actually, not all customers have the same needs
Right.
or experience your value in the same way. So I really like that.
Mhm.
And Rita, I guess inevitably in our work, and I'm sure in your work, it's much easier to work with enlightened leaders that are open, giving your Honeywell example. And active listening kind of goes pretty far, but sometimes you come across, we call it the incumbent mindset, that deeply kind of fortified mindset that's just really difficult to unpick. And so, just one more thing, I think we have a mantra, which is the customer always gets a seat at the table. And we're
Mm,
always amazed that the same 8 to 10 people sit around the table
Table.
having these conversations without bringing that extra perspective in. And I've earned the right to sit at this table when in fact
mhm.
the person on the shop floor or the young woman sort of in the customer service center working with customers every day who can bring those perspectives almost never see light of day in the C-suite. How do you respond to that?
Absolutely. Oh, I think you're absolutely right. And in my most recent book, I say what you really want is a rich flow of information from the edges of the organization, from the front lines,
Mm.
to the corner office, because it's so easy to wrap yourself in bubble wrap and miss what's really important and not understand the customer's frustrations or their needs or what they really value. And the other thing is that I find with senior leaders is they may at one point have had a really good read on the customer, but that read gets old over time. It
Right.
gets obsolete. New needs come up. Human beings are astonishing, by the way. We are so good. We are so ingenious at adapting to our environment. So if you had said to somebody 150 years ago, which in historical time is the blink of an eye, right? That's not much of anything. If you had said you would be able to fly from where Matt is to where Rondo is, not in days, but in a matter of hours. And you would sit reasonably comfortably in this steel tube that would hurtle through the atmosphere, at hundreds of miles per hour. And you would step off and feel a little tired, but otherwise none the worse for wear. They would have looked at you as though you were mad. And you would have been given what was understood about technology at the time. At the time, to undertake that journey was, months probably of very difficult voyages in a boat, probably propelled by
Yep.
sails, and yet today, what do we do when we're flying? It's magical. It's this astonishing thing. And what do we whine about? Oh, they didn't have my food selection, or wow, it was so crowded in the business class lounge, or whatever our particular issue is. We take the magic of it completely for granted. So the point of that is to say customers who may have been over the moon at one point about what you offered, and therefore you have settled into your comfortable, I'm a premium provider, I'm perceived as the number one, I'm perceived as whatever it is. That may be an out of date assumption and an out of date perception of what customers really think about you.
To put a bow on that, one of the things that we believe that insurgent organizations do well is that they are very customer proximate. They
Mhm.
maintain that it's being customer proximate, and that allows them to get that perspective on what the customer really needs, the jobs that need to be done for that customer. So you always stay on top of things. And that can come from, to your point, to Matt's point, about engaging people on the front line and bringing those voices into the conversation, but I think it just speaks to the fact that over time, organizations start to focus so much internally that they lose sight of the external world, and in particular, the customers and how their needs and wants are changing over time, and they get disconnected from that. So they imagining that what was true, to your point, years ago are still held true today, and they're operating on those assumptions.
Yeah. Steve Jobs made a really interesting observation about this years ago. He said, if you're the dominant player in a category, let's say you're Xerox or something, the benefit that you're going to get from making your product better and better and better is relatively small. So what you're going to do then is you're going to let the people who are in marketing or the people who are in sales or whatever, take the reins, because that's where you're going to grow, right? You're going to grow by adding more customers, by whatever. But improving the product is not really something that's going to make your life a lot better. And he would argue that there's this kind of seesaw almost between the product people being the ones that got you there, that
Mhm.
position of dominance. And yet, once you're there, the incentives change in a different way, and the product people kind of get pushed out.
Yeah. Do you think that that's because there's a lack of focus on the value creation for customers, value creation for other stakeholders, as opposed to how do I improve the performance of this product, but am I really creating value in the market? Like, do people lose sight of that kind of a conversation?
Oh, definitely, definitely. And I think the dilemma that we have, especially as a company gets more complex, is we construct these incentive and reward systems, which causes people to optimize around local um, optimization, right? It's the
Hmm.
rare company that says, hey, you're going to be part of what you get rewarded for is the performance of the company as a whole. So I'll give you an example of how this went terribly wrong. I was working with an elevator company, and they had two divisions. One was the new elevator division, and the other was the service division. And so at that time, the business model was you fought like crazy to get your new elevator installed, and that was awesome. And then you benefited from 20 or 30 or 40 years of service revenue that came after that. So that was the business model, basically. And yet the two divisions got incented on their costs, their throughput, their productivity, and all that. But interestingly, there's a lag, right? So what had happened was that the new elevator people had made a bunch of design and engineering decisions, which then went into production in these new elevators that created enormous cost and inefficiency problems down the road for the service people. But because they weren't looking at this problem together when these decisions were made, nobody saw it. And of course, it takes 4 or 5 years for a new elevator to actually need a lot of service. So this problem went unresolved for years before it finally came to the surface. And then they realized they had a huge misalignment problem between what the new elevator people were doing with their designs and what the repair people were doing with theirs.
Rita,
Yeah.
can I take that debate on that a little bit and may try to lift that up? We have a term for what you just described, which is called the invisible contract. And let me just try to describe what that is. Um, Professional CEOs hired by the board are typically given a mandate to, for example, here's the elevator company, here's a business model or a collection of incumbent business models, a set of products, an organizational model that's set up to your point, optimize for functional efficiency inside that model. With me so far? Okay. Now, the board will hire a CEO, and here's the invisible contract. Rita, I'm going to hire you to run this business, and your goal is to grow and extend it, but under no circumstances are you to screw up the current business model or really change it. That's the invisible part, right? So
Right.
Mhm.
the strategy that, I guess the mindset on strategy, and I want to explore this with you, the mindset on strategy is very much you're almost pulling a small number of levers, right? You can mess around with price. You can extend, to your point, the product or service. You can pursue new geography or jurisdictions. You can find a new customer niche. Maybe you can vertically integrate. Maybe you can pursue close adjacencies. But basically, your whole strategic scope sort of fits in those six levers. And
Mhm.
so you end up in a situation where you can only extend because of the invisible contract. And to your point, because that contract translates into hundreds of KPIs for sometimes tens of thousands of people,
Mhm.
which becomes very difficult to unpick. And then when the market has changed, the customer needs evolve because of substitutes or whatever, that business model becomes obsolete.
Exactly.
But it's often not a part of the strategy mindset to think about how to re not reboot, but sort of rethink or recapitalize an existing model or create a different model, which obviously is something that the challenger does much better than the incumbent. What are your thoughts on that point?
Oh, absolutely. I could describe that in many, many, many cases. I think the challenge that a lot of these sort of new CEOs face is that they're not given the right to say, let's set the legacy aside. If we were starting fresh, what would we be doing in this space? What would somebody who is new to this area come to do? And I think the other thing that I would observe is companies that do this well tend to have a couple of qualities. They tend to really see themselves as communities. So it's not a lot of people who are just there for the transactions. They tend to be connected to one another in a different way. They also tend to invest in exposing their senior leaders both to today's technologies, but also to what's going on tomorrow. And that has a bit of a cost, right? Because that takes time and it takes energy, and people have to be willing to do it. But what that results in is a socially cohesive group of people who have not just been focused on getting every last bit of value out of today's model, but they've also been exposed as a group to the future. So a company that exemplifies this is Fujifilm, and we talk lovingly about Rochester and Kodak and what happened,
Yeah.
but Fuji in many cases was in the same pickle. Their revenue was decimated by the end of film, as we knew it. They were dependent on that. That was where the big margins were. And yet you look at them today, and Kodak's shadow of its former self, and there's Fuji marching along. So what they did was they said, hey, what we're going to do is we're going to center on the technologies we know well, and we're going to be agnostic about the end markets into which this goes. So Fuji, the film company, found themselves in things like cosmetics and medical imaging and other kinds of strata, like floppy disk production they got into at one point, where the technologies they had mastered became useful in those spaces for solving previously unsolved problems. And so that's as much of a mindset thing as anything else. But I do think this concept of community, so we're all in this together, we've been exposed to these joint experiences, we are understanding what our center of the company is, and that gives us the courage to go into new areas. So it opens up more degrees of freedom than the situation you were talking about.
In the Fuji example, to what degree is that sort of coming back to this insurgent mindset or the mindset of leadership? I think that there's also a meta concept there, maybe, which is the big question: what business are we in, and what does that look like in the future? Now, in hindsight, we can look at Fuji and say, well, in a world that's going to be dominated by imaging, we're going to be an imaging ecosystem business. I'm sure that's not how they described it, but it's sort of, if you look at what they are now, it feels much more like that than we are a film
Right,
manufacturing and processing business,
right.
fundamentally. And I think that
Well,
sort of permission to change the scope, or at least open up the scope, plays a big role in that. And I often find leaders don't give
they
themselves that.
don't They don't.
Mm.
Yeah.
Or they rely on a past model. I mean, you talk about Kodak. One of the things that really did Kodak in was their CEO Antonio Perez decided to squarely aim the company at printing because he'd built and run HP's big printing business before. He decided to aim Kodak at printing at exactly the moment screens were getting good enough that nobody needed to print. So that was a strategic decision. So I think one of the things to think about if you're a new CEO, if you're somebody trying to build this insurgent mindset, is how am I centering my company? And there are different options that you have, right? So if you look at Amazon, very clearly centered around customer centricity. If you look
Mhm.
at classic Sony, right? Sony was clearly centered on quality. We're going to not just improve quality for us, we're going to improve quality for all of Japan, right? I mean, very big strategic model. In the case of Fuji, we're going to center on our core technologies, and we're going to really figure out where there are markets that have value for those. So I don't think that it's necessarily what business are we in, because I think that some ways can be kind of a narrowing question because the businesses of the future may not even express themselves the way they do today. So I talk about, for example, industries blurring, what
Mm.
business is What business is Google in? Who knows? Instead, what I like to talk about is competitive arenas, where an arena represents a pot of addressable resources and needs and possibilities, and different players are contesting in that arena for different kinds of outcomes. So, just to make it readily understandable, I have children that are in their sort of early 30s. And the last couple of years, it's just been wedding after wedding after wedding. And, every single wedding is an allocation of time, money, resources, attention. It's a
Mm.
hotel, it's whatever. So I don't care what business you're in. If you're trying to sell to somebody between the ages of about 22 and 40, you're competing with weddings, whether you want to or not.
Right.
Mm.
I think this is a good point to segue into one of your other the concept that you're known for, which is transient advantage. Can you unpack that concept? Because I think it speaks to sort of what you're getting at here right now. It's challenging the conventional way that people would think about competitive advantage. Can you talk about transient advantage?
Sure. So for a couple of things. So strategy of the field had its roots in industrial economics, which makes two simplifying assumptions about the world. The first is that there is such a thing as an industry, and it exists. And the second thing is that the normal state of things is equilibrium. And so from that world, we've inherited this concept of sustainable competitive advantage, which was everybody's, holy grail in strategy. So the idea was you found an
Yeah.
attractive position in an attractive industry, you threw up entry barriers like crazy, and then you sort of giggled to yourself as you enjoyed this sustainable competitive advantage that nobody else could attack. Instead, what I argue is that more and more, especially as things move towards services, as things move towards digital, we've got these transient advantages. And the life cycle of a transient advantage looks something like this. In the beginning, right, there's the innovation process, which is this primordial soup of ideas and people and ecosystems and like all this stuff. And the entrepreneurial function or the innovation function is to put some combination of those things together that fill a need in a market that somebody will pay you to do, right? So that value creation you guys talked about before. If you're successful at figuring that out, then you have this ramping up period. You have a period of launch. And if that works, if you get to your critical mass, then you have this wonderful period of exploitation where your advantage is in place, everything's going well, you can really enjoy that. But what happens next? And I can't predict your advantage is going to go away. What I can predict is it's going to come under pressure. Competitors are going to figure out what you're doing. Customers are going to get bored and move on. New technologies make what you're serving perhaps less relevant. And so if you can't figure out some way to extend your advantage, which sometimes you can, I mean, this is the thing that gives
Mhm.
us protein, low energy, all natural Coca-Cola.
Right.
But if you can't figure
Right.
that, if you're BlackBerry or if you're, a company where you can't come up with something that's relevant to a new segment or a new market, you go into this period of erosion. And the job then of the leader is to transition the center of gravity of the company to the next thing. So it's a transformation challenge. And what I would observe is that most of the leaders, most of the executives in most companies have had no experience at all with the beginning of that cycle or the end of it. What they've been hired to do, as you alluded to, Matt, is they've been hired to operate a successful business system. And that's
Mm.
operations, that's exploitation, right? They have never had to be innovative, and they certainly haven't had the challenge of transforming something that is broken into something else.
Yeah. So does that speak to the idea that companies, and we talk about this as an insurgent mindset, need to be focused on innovation as like their job, everybody's job. Innovation need to be seen as everybody's job. And the idea of building a learning organization where new ideas are constantly being bubbled up and there's an environment where people are able to take risks, calculated risks to some extent, right? Small, to your point, small bets to sort of learn, but also you're constantly innovating. You can't just go with the big bangs. You got to constantly be innovating to find where's the next on ramp for this new advantage that you're looking for, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think the big mistake I think a lot of companies make is they optimize to the point where there's no slack in the system. People have no desire or incentive to take that extra time and be curious about, well, why did a customer say that? There's no forum for getting, those kinds of ideas flowing across the company. So when you think about innovation, there are really three parts to it that need to be considered. So the first you mentioned, which is you need a constant flow of good ideas. And a lot of people who don't know anything about innovation think that's the problem. Oh, if we just had the right idea, the idea is the easy part. Like we have hundreds of ideas. Humans are ingenious. By the time
Right.
we're done with this podcast, your listeners will have had 10 ideas. So yes, it's important to have ideas. I'm not saying they're not, but what comes next is incubation, which is I go from an idea to
Mhm.
something that I can test and validate against some kind of customer need or desire. And then, if I'm successful at doing that, then we have acceleration, which is this launch process I alluded to. And a lot of times in acceleration, you need a different team, you need different capabilities. Now, all of a sudden, the mothership has to get involved. You have to say, hello, procurement, legal, come on and let's talk. And so there's a sort of a sea change that takes place when a business that's grown from within has to mature.
Yeah. But it's
Mm.
part of that
So
just because
Rita,
most organizations are more about control and less about learning. So if you're really an innovation organization, you should be a culture where you're constantly learning and that's rewarded. But most
yes.
organizations are about controlling to make sure that, as Matt says, you don't do anything bad to the current business. That's the focus.
It is, yeah. And if you think about a lot of our completely taken for granted management practices, just think of some of the phrases over the years. Management by exception, right? Uh,
Hmm. Hmm.
MBOs, right? Management objectives, management by objectives. Exceptions are bad. You need to squeeze out variability. And there are cases in which that is true, right? If I'm my pilot flying my next plane, I don't want to try to do an in-air experiment. Do
Right.
exactly, if you're managing a very volatile steel smelting process, or if you're running a nuclear plant, you want that absolute predictability. But what we do as people is we take the practices that we've learned that we feel comfortable with, and then we put them everywhere. When we haven't sort of stepped back and said, well, what kind of operations does this particular context require? So I'm working on another book. It's on the concept is on permissionless organizations, and by that I don't mean chaotic
Mhm.
ones. What I mean is how do we make organizations that are fit for the purpose that they're trying to accomplish? And increasingly, what I'm seeing in these organizations is operations that are much more human and connected and innovating continuously, but they're not being run like control hierarchies because the information is just too rapidly changing and too fuzzy for them to do that.
Yeah.
Mm.
Interesting.
So Rita, I want to explore the innovation side of this for a second. I guess you characterize the incumbent who's not able to prioritize that full cycle innovation that you talked about. So that's a gap. But I guess we find in the incumbent sort of, the Kodaks of the world, they tend to prioritize innovation off of their existing platforms. So the next product. And they also tend to look deep inside to innovate on productivity and efficiency of their existing model, right? So that becomes the innovation sort of playground almost. And but when the crisis comes or that advantage erodes, to your earlier point, they're woefully unprepared. So they have a cycle. They do have a cycle, but that cycle is almost aimed at the wrong thing. And I totally agree that there's plenty of ideas, and I guess kind of closing the circle back to your point about these territories for value. Um, What's the advice that you would give to a leader in that incumbent mindset to be able to find innovation? Like let's take BlackBerry. BlackBerry, they kept making the keyboard better and better and better. They kept going after the incremental customer. They worked their operating system and then they were obsolete and gone, right? So
Yep.
they're obviously innovating, but they're innovating almost inside and they're innovating at the frontier of the customer engagement, but not beyond it. And then Apple comes and they're innovating in a different sphere beyond the frontier of BlackBerry's experience with customers and offering something completely different with, really importantly, a completely different business model, right? So now there are lots of BlackBerry CEOs out there. And quite
Hmm.
unfortunately, I'm sure it's the same with you. We end up working with these companies at that end point when they've been around for 50 years and all of a sudden the model's obsolete and you know the products aren't performing, customers are going away, EBIT is down, all that stuff, right? And finally, you've got to reprogram these businesses. Now, we prefer to work with companies that are ahead of the curve on that, but they almost never are. So how do you just wrap that up for us in terms of, what's your advice for business leaders to, break that nexus? Because clearly it's much easier to work with a startup that's challenging that is unencumbered by all of this history and all the
Mhm.
things that we've discussed.
Yeah, what's the old line? Sure, God created the earth in 7 days, but he didn't have an installed base.
I may borrow that. Thank you.
So I think my answer to that begins with two kinds of value that you create as a leader. And the first kind of value is low uncertainty values. That's you turn the crank, money comes out, and a lot of our business metrics are totally geared toward that, right? So existing
Mhm.
business exploit, that's great. What we forget in business, although we remember it as humans, what we forget is there's another kind of value, which is what you're preparing for when uncertainty becomes higher. And that is the value of options, option value, where an
Mhm.
option represents a small investment you're making today that buys you the right, but not the obligation to make a bigger investment down the road. And as humans, we do this all the time. We go to a conference where we don't know exactly who we're going to meet, but we have a pretty good feeling it's a pretty high quality conference. I'll probably make some useful contacts. Maybe that'll lead to sales down the road, but don't get out a slide rule and estimate the value of each minute we spend there with the value of who we're going to contact and how good the beer is. I mean, we don't do that. We invest in these things because we know that they're good. We send our children to college, right? What am I going to get for my daughter's degree in modern European history, 10 years from now? I have no idea, and neither does she. By the way, could we get all of European history? No, just modern European. But we know that if we don't do these things, that we cut off options for the future. So as human beings, we do this all the time, right? And yet somehow when we get into business, we forget that that is a very simple law of being adaptive to your environment, that you have to have future value in terms of options as well as present value. And this has implications for how you structure your portfolios of investments. And it gets to your governance program, right? So there are a bunch of things you're going to do that keep today's business happy. Do those things, pay the bills. This is good. Pay our consulting fees. We love that.
Right.
So keep that happening. That's good. Then we have things that are platforms for the future. And Amazon Web Services would be a great example. I mean, what earthly right does a book retailer have to do getting into enterprise level software services? But they did it, right? And so it became a platform for future growth. Today, nobody bats an eye. Amazon Web Services is one of their most profitable lines of business. It's the core today. But then you have options, and options are these small things that you're investing in, not because you know what's going to happen, but because they literally open the aperture of your opportunities to encompass a greater range of future possibilities than you could if you just stuck to the core. And the reality is most of them won't work. 90% or more will fail, which is why you need to keep them cheap and small. You need to be very mature about how you deal with them not working out, right? So it can't be regarded as a failure. It's got to be regarded as an experiment, a hypothesis, a learning opportunity. And if you are lucky and you are diligent about making sure you keep those options open, one or more of them may eventually take on the form where you say, whoa, this could be a platform for future growth. And that's when you can move forward with confidence to execute against them. So my advice is really be a human being for your business just as easily as you are for yourself in your own world.
Rita, it's been really interesting to spend 40 minutes not talking about AI. But
Right.
and I'm actually grateful for that, but I can't help myself. Is
Sure.
this world with AI fundamentally different, or is this just another set of capabilities that we need to put in our mixing bag? Now, there's no doubt that technology plays a role in reducing the time to advantage, I suppose, but what are your thoughts on this
Well,
sort
if
of
I were to
AI
draw
arena?
Yeah, well, if I were to draw analogies to the past, electricity was like that, right? I mean, there was
Right.
a period before electricity, and then once we had electricity, everything was different. How we organized factories was different. How we lived life at home was different. And the second analogy I would draw would be plastic, right? Before there was plastic, we had a lot of things that were very different than the way that we just take them for granted today. And plastic became ubiquitous across the economy. And I think AI is a bit like that because what it's going to do is like electricity, it releases some constraints. But it's going to also open up some interesting additional ones. So if you go back to electricity, before you had electricity, the whole line of a manufacturing facility was built in a row because it was dependent on a single energy source, whether that be a steam engine or a river or a mill or something. But everything was dependent on everything. The factory ran 24/7. You couldn't turn the river off at night and go home. And it took 40 years before we figured out from the principles of electricity, before we figured out what factory arrangements could that facilitate, what office arrangements could that facilitate, what different social structures could that facilitate. And I think AI has a bit of that to it. So where we are right now is the irrational exuberance part of the cycle,
Yeah.
where people are just experimenting with it and everybody hopes their model will be the one that wins. And is it large models? Is it small models? Is it what is it? So we're at that kind of wildly experimental part of it. But I think where it will start to take root, just as we saw with electricity and plastic, there'll be constraints that these technologies start to relax, which are going to be very powerful. And there are going to be new constraints that they impose, which will both destroy and create roles for human beings. Do I think it's the end of the world? No. Do I think it's important? Absolutely.
Mhm.
And I would say when I'm optimistic, what we see is that we can use these technologies to introduce more humans in the loop. So if you think of most of our service and or care sectors, right? So I'm providing customer service or I'm taking care of someone. So education, medicine, da, 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 da. Historically, they've been very low productivity sectors. Why is that? It's because it takes $1 million to train a doctor, for example. And, we can't afford to use them as much as the demand would like us to. But once you've got AI in the system, and this is an idea that's been flaunted by Paula Blank, who's the former president of Southern New Hampshire University. He says, what you can do is if you can eliminate the need for the $1 million doctor and have somebody who's paid a little bit less, but who could use AI to perform some of the things a doctor has to do today, you could actually put many more humans in the system, which would give you more employment. It would give you better systems of care, and it would allow you to, as he puts it, flood the zone with humans. And so if you think about it that way, AI could have a very beneficial consequence. Now, AI is going to be doing things like writing the press release because that's what the intern used to do, and the intern
Right.
probably doesn't do it as well as the AI did. But when you think about these much more large scale care things that are so deeply human and so deeply underserviced and underfunded and under resourced in much of our economy, I think there's a really bright spot potentially there for deploying AI.
Okay, good.
Very
Um,
interesting.
Now, Rita, one last question for me, and then to Rhonda, and we'll let you go. Who would be, if we were to look at executives in traditional organizations, who would be your leading insurgent mindset examples? In other words, who would we talk to get a real perspective on kind of enlightened leaders with this mindset and these capabilities that you've described
Mhm.
um,
Yeah,
in
they're a rare,
in
they're
big
a,
companies today? Who
yeah,
are
they're a
they?
rare breed. They're a rare breed. I call them Sherpas.
Sherpas.
Sure.
Yeah, and a Sherpa is, if you're going to go climb Mount Everest, right? You better have a Sherpa with you. He's going to say, "Whoa, whoa, whoa, wind from that direction. We're going to go here." If it's Tuesday, we need to move a little faster. If whatever, the organizational equivalent is the person who's really great at connecting different parts of the organization, both internally and externally. They're incredible networkers. They have very open minds to seeing what's going on. Their work is often kind of invisible. Because they give a lot of credit away to make sure that things happen in a change-worthy way, and you know them when you see them because they constantly talk about we. They make endless references to other parts of the organization and how they connect. They're also always talking about stuff from the outside. They have a very externally oriented motivation. They have different job titles, and that's been interesting to me. So sometimes they'll be the chief innovation officer, or the chief strategy officer, or sometimes they'll even be buried in finance or operations or something. But the quality that you're looking for, in my opinion, is this ability to forge connections across groups that otherwise wouldn't have it, and that ability to bring the outside in.
Interesting.
Thanks, Rita.
Interesting. That's great. So Rita, we didn't get a chance to talk about your other book, since Seeing Around Corners. But I do have a final question, and maybe you can your answer, wrap that into your answer. We usually like to wrap up by asking our guests to, provide a lesson or a piece of advice to our audience of leaders who are trying to navigate, these disruptive environments and periods of uncertainty. Because really, the insurgent mindset is how do we build future-ready leaders? So, what lessons or pieces of advice would you offer to our audience?
Oh, well, the thing about seeing around corners, which is about strategic inflection points, that I think is an interesting lesson is, I when I first started looking at this, and I drew on the work of Andy Grove, who was the first person to really
Yeah.
make this idea popular, that there was these things called strategic inflection points. And I wrestled with it for years because I thought, what kind of strategic inflection point comes out of the atmosphere and bops you on the head and changes the world forever? What do you do with that? And then a friend sent me a wonderful article, and it was called "What If You Changed the World and Nobody Noticed?" And the article was about the Wright brothers' historic flight in 1903, proving that manned flight was possible. It took 5 full years before any respectable newspaper went and actually looked at what the Wright brothers were doing and recognized that manned flight had been conquered. And that to me is the leadership opportunity, which is, these things don't happen overnight. They feel like they do, so, oh my God, it's November of 2022, and now we've got but people have been working on artificial intelligence for 50 years. So I think the mindset that we're looking for is the openness to looking for leading indicators. So not the past, right? Not what's worked in the past, but leading indicators. What are those weak signals that might indicate something's going to be happening? And the openness and the willingness to spend the time on it. Because what I find is the biggest barrier to people being successful at seeing around corners is they just don't make the time for it. And I mean, make the time, not when I get around to it, if I have a chance, maybe over the weekend, maybe while I'm mowing the lawn. No, really sit down and put it in your calendar as time I'm going to spend thinking about the future. And if you got leaders with that mindset, you've got much more of a chance, I think, at finding people that are willing to be insurgents than people that are wedded to the status quo.
Yeah. Yeah. We often tell clients sometimes you got to have a day job and a night job, right? And strategy in the future has to be a part of that, right? So think about it that way. I think this has been great, incredibly rich and thought-provoking conversation, Rita. Thank you so much for joining us. I know that our listeners will benefit from hearing your perspective on strategy and innovation. And to our listeners, I encourage you, if you haven't already done so, get her book, The End of Competitive Advantage and, Seeing Around Corners. They're both worth reading. So thank you so much, Rita. It was great to have you with us.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Okay, Rondo. Well, that was really interesting to have Rita on here to kind of give us a really quick tour of her body of work and certainly really underpin the message to leaders that looking around the corner can't be a side gig for you. You have to really invest the time
Yeah.
and energy there.
Yeah, I mean, I've been exposed to her work for many years now, and just the concepts just resonate with a lot of what we talk about in terms of the insurgent mindset. In particular, I love the, seeing around corners. She talks about, she didn't mention it in the podcast, but she has this saying, I think she got it from the book, Only the Paranoid Survives. And it's snow melts from the edges. And the idea, which is why you need to sort of make some assumptions as to what are some of the weak signals that you should be looking out and monitoring so that you can then, if you need to make a decision, decide what you're going to do. But it's really interesting concepts. And the whole idea of transient advantage versus sustainable advantage, I totally agree with it. But
Mm.
it's what we talk about when we say organizations need to be thinking about, are there, new business models that you need? Do you need to reimagine your business model? I think all of those sort of speak to an inflection point that is pending or here, and organizations not making that transition to something new
Yeah,
and
I
different.
think we didn't explore that very much, but I think so many leaders ignore the strong signals, let alone the weak signals, right?
Right.
So, I think it's a great reminder to, pay attention. I think it really comes back to this whole idea that, what fundamentally separates the insurgent from the incumbent is the outside in perspective, and being
Right.
able to sense and respond to that market and, in an agile way reallocate resources to those opportunities as compared to the inside out projection of doing more of what we already do somewhat better. And I think that really
Right.
that's really underscored by the points that Rita made. And you know, I think that Rita's work is certainly seminal in this category, and I very much enjoyed having her in the podcast.
Yeah. Yeah, she's great. No, it's been great. So our audience, if this episode really resonated with you, feel free to subscribe to our channel on YouTube or follow us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. And also check out our companion blog at insurgentsgroup.com where we'll have a summary of the key takeaways from each episode.
And I'm Matt Tice from the Insurgent Mindset.
I'm Rondo Moses. Stay bold, stay curious, stay
All right.
insurgent.
All the best, Rondo.